see a bit, yeah.
Towards you.
Towards me. I thought he was going water, didn't you? Is that better? Being a bit obtuse, obviously. Yeah. Okay.
How does he know?
Look at this. It's absolutely nuts. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's very nice and a little bit daunting to see so many people standing in front of me. It's really great that you've come along. This is a panel on editing culture, the culture of editing. It's all going to be about how we edit translations from various languages. So first off, I'm just going to introduce my colleagues here. On my right, we have Katharina Bielenberg. She's the associate publisher at MacLehose Press, an imprint of Quercus, now part of the Hachette Book Group. MacLehose Press is celebrating its 10th year. Yes, celebrating its 10th year. Aims to publish the best literature from around the world, mostly literary fiction, some crime fiction, a little narrative non-fiction, but all but a very few in translation. MacLehose authors include Dasha Dundich. Oh, I shouldn't have said this. Do you want to read these?
Maëlys de Kerangal, Pierre Lemaitre, Lars Mitting, Anurada Roy, Jorn Kalman Stefansson, Juan Gabriel Vasquez, and David Lagerkrantz. But they're just a few of the...
Well done. On my left is Magda Kerneci. She's a Romanian writer, a translator, an editor, an art historian, and a curator. As a literary editor, she was editor-in-chief of the issue of Romania, Land of Orpheus, of the Poets Literary Magazine in Paris. She also co-edited the issue dedicated to Romanian poetry by the Confluence Poétique magazine in Paris in 2008. From 2001 to 2010, she was the coordinator of the Gemini collection of international poetry at Paralela 45 Publishing House in Bucharest. As a translator, she published many French and English poets in diverse literary magazines in Romania. She's also published several books in translation of authors like Christopher Merrill, Catherine Duradan, Pierre Ostier, Nicolas Brossard, Daniel Philippe Dessoudres. At present, she's preparing an anthology of French contemporary poetry in Romanian. And last but not least, we have Will Firth, who comes from Newcastle in Australia. He studied German and Slavic languages in Canberra, Zagreb, and Moscow. And since 1991, he's been living in Berlin, Germany, where he works as a translator of literature and the humanities from Russian, Macedonian, and all variants of, dare I say it, Serbo-Croatian. His best received translations of recent years have been Robert Pereshic's Our Man in Iraq, Andrei Nikolaidis' Ultineum trilogy of novellas, and Faruk Shehic's Quiet Foes the Una, all published by Istros Books, of which I am the director. So that's my short introduction. And Istros Books is a small micro-publisher, and we publish literature in translation from the Balkan, Southeast Europe region. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, this panel is based on the premise that different cultures have different editing traditions, and that whereas in some countries each book that's published goes through the hands of an experienced editor, in others books can be published very much as the author has delivered them. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different people's experiences with that. I'm going to start with Katharina because she has a long experience of working with books in translation, some of which needed extreme editing perhaps, and others less so. I know that Stieg Larsson is on your list, so I'm sure people will be interested in the editing of Stieg Larsson, but I'll take it away, Katharina.
Yeah, so we translate from 23 different languages, and by and large, actually, books come to us in very good condition. I mean, they're books that have done well in their own languages, which is why we've heard of them. Some of them have won many prizes. Nevertheless, there's always a time when you think, or even when the agent offers, you're not going to want to read about this bit, that will have no cultural relevance to you. By all means, be free and take it out. That happens in some instances. For example, with a book called Look Who's Back by Timur Vermes, which was a satire of Hitler waking up in Berlin in 2003. And it really was Hitler, so you have to suspend your disbelief, and basically taking on modern German media culture, and people just think he's the most fabulous impersonator. And I remember at the start, Jutta Wieland, the publisher, editor, the writer at Eichborn said, take out the Oktoberfest chapter, nobody wants to hear about that. And I said, actually, if there's one chapter that would have relevance to English people, it's probably the one about the Oktoberfest. But it was a really nice experience, because the author, it was really the one book of his that had, he'd done some ghostwriting before, but this was his first proper book in translation, and he was so delighted at how it had done in Germany. He just said, I want it to work, so you make it work in your countries as well as you can. And in fact, they organized in Strahlen, which is a sort of translators' residence on the borders of Germany and France, or Germany and Belgium. Timur arrived with, I think, 13 different translators from different countries, and they sat and went through the book around a table for about 4 days and tackled any translational difficulties that, for example, the Chinese publisher might have, or and he was, he just said, make it work, make the humor work, do what you can, reimagine the jokes, because jokes are the most difficult thing to translate, and I think each country did incredibly well with it. In our version, for example, there was a Berliner character, and if anyone knows Berlin German, it's wonderful to listen to, Berlinerisch, and Timur had written this all very carefully down, so you could actually hear the language, and of course you can't translate that. So the way Jamie Bullock, the translator, did it was he turned it into someone who talks like that all the time. So everything goes up at the end of the sentence, and everything's like this and like that, and somehow just did something different with it. But that's a case of an author just saying, take it away and do what you can. And in fact, the book itself, we didn't take out a sentence of it. So that was one experience. And in other terms, I mean, just on the Stieg Larsson thing, it was complicated by the fact that he had died by the time we were translating the books, and so there was no one to refer to for changes, and when there were mistakes which came to light because so many people had read it, and I think you hear more about mistakes according to how many people have read the book. So when it gets into the millions, and it had been translated and was sold in Australia, and someone in Australia said, so she goes to a sheep farm in a place where sheep would die because there's no water. It has to be either a cattle farm or you have to move it to the other side of Australia. And so we had to redo a whole route. And this was after the book had sold internationally probably something like 30 million copies.
So in the next edition you edited it?
We changed that. And then we got things like someone wrote in and said, Michael Blomqvist opens a bottle of Puligny Montrachet 1964, but that was a really terrible vintage, and it would either have to be 56 or, So those are and that's that is the fun stuff to do.
Yeah.
One more thing on the Stieg Larsson was that I think there were sort of 6 people called Anderson in book 1, and one was a police officer, one was a baddie, one was a good guy, one was a shopkeeper, and so we kept having to ask for more Swedish names because otherwise all the English people had been completely confused. So, but I wouldn't say on one last point where we're in the process of editing down quite substantially a book that was written originally in Swedish, and it was 600 pages long, and we just thought we're going to edit it down to about 400 and then sell the foreign rights because it just becomes a more attractive prospect for translation.
Yes.
And there are always mistakes, and the translators, I mean, we'll talk about it, are the closest readers of a book apart from the author, maybe even more so than the author themselves. So they're always picking out inconsistencies, I think.
Yeah. Can I just go back to you on one point, your Translators Residence?
Yes.
So who organised that? Maybe also importantly, who financed that with the Look Who's Back book?
How does
that work?
I think it was the Goethe Institute together with the Strahlen. I mean, it's a very established organisation, and I think they might have cultural funding from the German government. but the house exists there, so people can go and stay and
they
apply
brought all
for...
the potential translators together
Yeah.
with the author to
Yeah.
discuss.
Yeah, and that happens... I'm not sure it happens regularly, maybe a few times a year. And they have the most incredible library as well, so of
That's
German
amazing,
literature. So
yeah.
it's a really nice experience.
And they stay there for a week or something.
Stay there
or-
for 4 or 5 days. I mean, Strahlen itself, when Jamie went, he said he walked around the village in about 20 minutes, and then he thought, I don't know, well, I'll get back inside and read a book now. There wasn't very
No
much else.
distractions.
No distractions, yeah, exactly.
That's really interesting. Okay, I'm going to ask Will now a bit of with his experience with translations, and obviously, as you've just been told, translators are the closest readers, but can they also be editors? That's the question, or do they get forced into the role somehow? Would you like to talk about your experience, Will?
Yes, I think we often get forced into the role, particularly I do, because I translate mainly contemporary writers from the language with many names, Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian, and also Macedonian. And whereas I think fairly rigorous standards of editing applied in ex-Yugoslavia, I think in the last 2 or 3 decades that's really slipped. And there's a whole range of different editing practices. Some editors are very good and rigorous, but there are a lot of books that go to print after very scanty editing or no editing at all. And I think there's a bit of a north-south divide. That's happened quite a lot with books by Macedonian and Montenegrin authors, not so much with Croatian authors, but also there sometimes the editors are a bit too lenient, I'd say. There are all sorts of issues involved. Recently, the last book that was printed, one of my translations by the Croatian writer Miroslav Krleža, he's sort of regarded as the greatest Croatian modernist of the 20th century. They'd gone to the effort of altering the spelling so it conformed to the modern Croatian standard, whereas the young Krleža wrote in more sort of Serbo-Croat. They'd done that, which was an enormous effort, I think, and then at some stage the manuscript had been scanned, and no one had gone through the final version before printing to check up, the typical scanning errors that we had in the age of fax machines. The letter M would dissociate into an I and an N, and 2 tall vertical letters like a T and an L would switch places, and so on. So I had that problem recently, actually. That was quite perplexing in places. But yeah, generally I have to be an editor as well as a translator, and I actually enjoy that degree of responsibility because it also gives me a bit of freedom to structure the book a bit the way I like. Like if I see a paragraph that could actually have been on the previous page, then I'll suggest that to the publisher and the capital E editor and the author, and if they're in agreement, then we'll shunt that paragraph somewhere else, for example.
How often are they in agreement? Always grateful.
Usually they're in agreement, and they're generally always grateful when I make suggestions because, like you said, the translator is often the best reader, or the reader who reads a book in most detail. And I've had multiple authors say to me, "Oh, I didn't realize that. Thank you for picking that up. If we do another edition of the original, I'll definitely change that. Thank you so much." And that's a really nice feeling. There are all sorts of changes that I need to make on a regular basis. I don't know if they'd be considered editing, for example, reducing the amount of repetition, because I think in English we're a bit more sensitive to that, whereas in Serbo-Croat it doesn't really bother readers if the same verb is, cropping up in 3 or 4 sentences, or direct speech needs to be rendered differently, but that's fairly standard. You have that in other languages as well, French, I believe. Names are often a problem.
Names,
for example, if you have a story and there are 4 Marias and 3 Boškos in it and 5 Jankos, the reader is going to start getting confused. So that then starts off a game with, do you use more pronouns or do you introduce a surname or 2? I've actually suggested a few times to authors that we change the name of a character, even a major character, either to avoid confusion like this, or because of the semantics.
Yeah.
One of the books that Susan and I did, Our Man in Iraq, had a main character called Tin in the original, T-I-N, which is a fairly common name, or a name that's not uncommon in Dalmatia. But I thought fairly early on that we couldn't keep this name in English. Firstly, tin is the name of a metal,
Yeah.
and cropping up having tin, 200 times in the text might create a strange impression. It's got nothing to do with metal. There's also the character Tintin, which many of us know and love. I thought this guy's got to have a different name, so I suggested Tony and Tino. I think we settled for Tino in the end.
I think, yeah.
So I guess that's editing to an extent. I often make those decisions, or at least I don't make them, I suggest them. And if everyone's in agreement, then we do make that kind of decision, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Will and I have worked together on 10 books over 5 years or something, so we have a kind of symbiotic relationship now where Will's doing the translation, and then he'll already be sent to me with like various suggestions for edits, let's call them, small or large, and then I go through them and I put my suggestions, then we kind of thrash it out over Skype usually, don't we? And then when we get to our final decisions, we approach the author and ask them if they're amenable to, if there are any big changes, certainly, yeah.
While we were preparing for this event, you mentioned preserving the local flavour. Shall I go into that now or not?
I'll ask Magda first, and then we can talk about flavour, yes. Magda, I wanted to ask you, well, a little bit about your experience in Romania. I know Romania has a very fine and vibrant publishing industry. You're translating a lot into Romanian, and Romanian books coming out into English and other languages. What's your experience of the editing culture in Romania? And maybe if you want to speak about poetry, or shall we leave that till later?
Maybe later.
Later, okay, start with that.
Thank you, Susan, for inviting me here. I just arrived from Bucharest, so please excuse me for my errors of English. I accepted Susan's invitation because I was impressed by the fact that she directs a publishing house specialized on the Balkan literatures. Because it's unusual, and because Balkan countries are not so well known and not so much translated into English and other foreign languages. So I said to myself, this is a nice opportunity to speak also about Romanian literature and culture, even if, in my view, Romania is not really a Balkan country. It is only a part of it, the southern part of Romania, which was influenced more or less by the Balkan culture and by the Ottoman Empire in the past. So Romania is a very tricky country, which is formed by 3 historical provinces, each of them influenced by another big empire. Transylvania, the west, was influenced by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Moldavia, the east, was influenced by the Russian Empire, and the southern part, Wallachia, was influenced by the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire influenced all the Balkan peninsula because it dominated it for centuries. The problem is that Romania has many influences and has to deal with this complex tradition and heritage. Normally, Romania was influenced by the French culture, and the French culture was dominant in the Romanian culture during the last more or less 150 years. But this has started to change in the last 40, 50 years because of the English influence, which has become more and more forceful. And this gives a strange and interesting taste to the Romanian culture. Romanian culture was very francophone, which means loving the French literature. And many of the terms and words in the cultural level come from French. But in the last decades, these words, which were numerous in Romanian, have started to be replaced by English words in a way which is very amazing for older generation, but very natural for the younger ones. And we have many pairs of words, one of French origin, another of English origin for the same thing or notion. For example, curator. We have curator and commissaire d'exposition, which is a little bit different in Romania. We have event, which is English, And we have also événement, which comes from événement in French. And we have many of these kind of pairs which appear in everywhere in the journalism and so on and so forth. And I myself have a more French-like experience because I used to live in Paris for 10 years, and French is like my second native language. But I also studied English at school. I was the first generation that could study English in the communist Romania during the 70s. So for me, English is very precious. It was like a victory against the system and against the communist coercion when I was a child. Afterwards, I studied in Paris during the 90s and so on. But more recently, as I became an editor, the editor-in-chief of a visual arts magazine in Bucharest, entitled Arta, which is bilingual in Romanian and in English, I had to deal with the translations from Romanian into English and from English into Romanian. And I've noticed this tendency in Romanian to import English words without transforming them in the rules of the Romanian grammar. And they are imported as such. For example, clubbing, to club or clubbing, or to party, which didn't exist before, and they sound a little bit strange for a Romanian ear, but they are more and more used by the young, and many words coming from internet or from IT domain, so are really copied as such in Romanian, and this creates a sort of tension in the grammatical structures of a language like Romanian, which is a Latin language, as you know. We are more closer to French, to Spanish, to Italian, and to Portuguese. Nevertheless, these kinds of import from English constitutes, in my opinion, a richness, an enrichment, because it gives a sort of flexibility to the contemporary language, which has to adapt to many new situations and to many challenges. So I try to do my best, for example, with this magazine, Visual Arts, which exists online. And there you can see the text in English and in Romanian. And I've noticed that my younger colleagues are more and more confident and fluent in English, which has become like their second native language. And this is a situation which I think is common for many countries like Romania, which are not so central to the huge cultural stage at an international level. I was amazed from this point of view that the Slovene country and culture, which is a small one, they have only 2 million people. They are much better known than other cultures from the region, Romania included, because they had very good translators into English, and they knew how to cultivate them, how to educate them, how to transmit a certain kind of tradition in this respect. I was in Slovenia several times to participate in diverse literary festivals, and I was really impressed by their cultural politics in this respect. And I suppose that it's the same situation in your publishing house, to have many Slovene writers translated, or not so many.
I do actually. I have many Slovene books, but that's because of a bilateral project with a Slovenian publisher. So I was involved in a bilateral project where we published 6 books in 3 years from Slovenian. So I'm rather top-heavy with Slovenian books, it's true. Yeah.
What about the Romanian books? How many?
I've published 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. Not bad. Not bad. Not
Yes.
bad.
Two by Mircea Eliade, who is a classic now in the international literature, and three.
Octavian Paller, that's poetry. Ioana Pavlescu and Cecilia Ștefănescu, yes, exactly. Yeah. I wonder if I might just pick up on your point about words entering the language, because of course when you're editing, you're sometimes editing out things, but sometimes you're editing them in, right? You're adding things because, you know, the English reader is not going to understand them, local words, etc. And that's a very difficult balance sometimes, to think how much of the language you leave in as a flavour, and then if you do you need a kind of glossary of what those words are, or should you just cut them out and find equivalents in English, for example? So it's something that always difficult for me. And obviously when you have a familiar language, let's say like French, maybe even German, you can leave things in, but you have an unfamiliar language like Macedonian, there's really not going to be any words that an English reader will understand. So I'm going to ask Katharina and Will to talk a little bit about their experience with their slang and dialect and taking in and putting in words.
Yeah, I think it's a really fine balance, because I think we always think that having footnotes is a complete no-no in a novel, because it turns it into a sort of semi-academic text.
Yeah.
And what we're struggling to do in England is to make it make translated literature accessible, and our 10th anniversary kind of promotion is called, we're calling it the Year of Adventurous Reading, and we've chosen 10 books that we're trying to get people who wouldn't normally pick up a translation to realise that actually it's no different from any other book, and you can learn a lot in the process. So we try not to sort of over-academicise our books by putting footnotes in, and so sometimes you have to find alternatives to bring across the flavour, but also to bring across the understanding. I'm just thinking of, for example, Look Who's Back had a lot of kind of German cultural references, which we could have just cut out, but we thought actually it's not a real stretch for people to understand who they are, and in fact the translator wrote a 2.5-page glossary at the end of the book that was highlighted at the front. So, you know, there's a glossary at the end of the book. There's no point in having a glossary at the end of the book if people don't realise it's there until they've finished reading it. That's one of the...
Are you a fan of notes from editors or glossaries?
I think sometimes it's just essential, because I think we always also rely on the intelligence of the reader. So if you don't know what something is or who something is, these days it's really easy to look it up.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do that anyway. A lot of people will read alongside, you know, with the phone alongside or whatever. But I think in some cases it can be really useful. We're about to publishing in January a really beautiful translation by Len Ricks of Magda Szabo's Catalin Street, which she wrote many years ago, and it's now it's been published in America by New York Review of Books, and we're doing it in January. And it starts off with a sort of very dreamy scene in a flat with lots of family members drifting around in a kind of state of shock, and it takes quite a long time, and some of the American critics of the book said it was 50 pages before they realized what all the family relationships were. So, for example, you know, a woman is living with a man, but he's not the father of her child, and in that case, actually, because the Americans put in at the end of the book a kind of pronunciation guide, which I think is also really nice for particularly Hungarian names. I realised that I would read them completely differently from how they should be pronounced. We're going to put in alongside the pronunciation guide of the names where they are in the family, because I think for some people it's really important to have that grasp really early on in the book, and some people like to discover it, however slightly vague the author and dreamlike the author wanted to make it come across. But generally it's a really fine balance, and I have lots of discussions with Christopher Maclose, who I work with, about the classic one of crime novels and police ranks, and whether you leave the police ranks in their original languages or not to bring across the flavour. And we decided in the end, after a really quite long and exhausting discussion, that it's okay in French in a way because people have read Maigret and they're a bit more familiar with it, but we started translating a series of crime novels set in the German Black Forest, and there are so many different German police ranks, and they literally all sound like SS officers or varieties of them. For example, the Polizeioberhauptmacher and the Kriminalhauptkommissar, and that's a bit of a stretch to expect an English readership to understand where they sit in the hierarchy. And you don't want to put a kind of spreadsheet in the book to explain what they all are. So we have translated them all into English, and we did the same with Swedish, which, you know, I don't think that's a loss in a way, because basically you want to have clarity as well as local colour. But it's a really fine balance, and I think for translators it's always worth, and many do, worth asking at the beginning where, I mean, we as a publishing house have a quite a detailed style sheet of how we would like things translated, and say to translators, please, I mean, keep to it as much as you can. Don't worry if there are bits you overlook, because we'll scoop it up in the next stage of editing. So that they have some kind of way of, you know, some sort of path to follow. But as for translators, if they're unsure, it's always worth asking at the beginning how publishers want these things to be done, because I think everyone works slightly differently. I don't know whether you have a...
Yeah. No, I was thinking about what you were saying about making translated books accessible. And I think, you know, the people who might not usually pick them up because they're afraid of translations for whatever reason. If they have a big glossary and pronunciation guide and I don't know what, in the beginning it might put them off, right? Because it seems too academic. I would like to think it wouldn't, but it might do. But certainly with the list of names, I mean, just from my own experience, I just read Master and Margarita, the Bulgakov, and because the Russian, they can put the patronyms in all different ways, I really couldn't remember half the time who the people were, and I thought, I wish they'd put a kind of character list in the beginning, because I could just revert back, oh, he's the poet, oh, he's the head of the Masolit, you know, whatever.
No, I think it's really useful. I think it's very useful.
Actually, Will and I, we did that at least in one book, didn't we, in The Great War?
Yeah, with another as well.
Yeah. So we had a very long 400-page book about the First World War, which had 78 characters in it, who kind of wove in and out of the text during the years of the war. And we said, we better put a character list, or people are just going to get lost and not know. And we also actually anglicised the spelling of the Serbian names, didn't we? It was a Serbian book, because we thought at that at that time, that is what would have happened. So we had the CH instead of the ch, and etc. But Will, how do you go about, I know this is something we talk about often, about the dialect, the slang, exactly. Can you give some examples?
Yes, translating humour is a bit of a nightmare. I never relish doing that. Slang is often a challenge. We've done that in different ways. I think with one of the books we actually chose a Croatian dialect. The book was in a Croatian dialect partly, and we chose Scottish, which is a bit difficult to reflect in writing. But and I don't think I'd do that again, but it was an interesting experiment. Some reviewers thought, that works very well. Others thought, I like to keep as much local flavour as possible. I wanted to say something about vocabulary, like looking at food and drink. The cultural distance between ex-Yugoslavia and the English-speaking world is quite large, and there aren't many foodstuffs that will work. Everyone knows baklava probably, everyone's drank or heard of vodka. You might know what rakia is, or raki, but then the similarities start becoming rather few and far between. Slivovitz sometimes works, but often I like to...
Like all the alcohol works and none of the food.
The alcohol tends to work. I like to preserve the original word, perhaps in italics, and give a short explanation. For example, sarma. How many of you have heard of sarma? Stuffed cabbage leaves or cabbage rolls. So I often add a word or two of explanation, and then depending on the book, depending on the context, it can be okay to use sarma in this case, again, multiple times in the book, or not. It depends a bit.
We have a bit of a kind of cultural mission, don't we?
We do.
Because part of the trouble of selling or publishing or promoting books from that region is because they're so unknown to readers here, but they will continue to be unknown unless we keep pushing them and telling people about them. So half the time you think, we should leave them in because these should be things that people know about, right?
For example, one of the novels we did together refers to a very popular ex-Yugoslav rock singer, Johnny Štulić.
Ah, yes.
and we didn't want to let his name sort of disappear, and we thought, how can we convey his significance and his style of music? And I didn't know his music terribly well. Susie did, and you suggested. What did you suggest?
I think I suggested
Yugoslavia's answer to Nick Cave.
That's it. There we
And
go.
that was right.
That says everything.
Yeah, there you go.
Otherwise, just to sort of come back to what Katarina was saying, all the editors I've worked with so far prefer to avoid footnotes or are outright allergic to them. So adding a word or two here or there is useful. A list of characters can be useful. Pronunciation guide, we haven't done that together, but I've done that with another publisher. And something that I guess belongs to this general topic is translators' notes. I correspond prolifically with my authors if they're alive, and a lot of these comments and issues go on to the editor. And in 2 instances, the editors have said, let's keep your comments, or at least most of them. So there's one translation in a literary magazine where I think a dozen of my comments actually written to the editor were published, and there's a whole novel where about 24 of my comments were published. And I felt a bit strange about that in the beginning, like, why is there this morbid fascination to pick the translator's brain? But then I thought, it's all for the higher good, so...
Somebody's probably writing a PhD on it now.
Magda, you had an interesting experience with a Catalan novel, yes?
Yes. Recently I read a book written by a Catalan writer. Her name is Clara Usson. The title of the novel is The Daughter of the East, the East Daughter. And it is an extraordinary novel because it relates the Balkan wars from 1992 to 1995. What is amazing in this novel is that a Catalan writer, not knowing the Balkan languages, was able to relate in such a detailed way the drama of many characters involved in these Balkan wars. And everything relates to Ana Mladic, the daughter of a well-known general, Mladic, who was a butcher of the Balkans and who was condemned afterwards by the International
Criminal
Court.
Tribunal,
Yes, but reading this novel, I was amazed by the way this woman was able to reconstruct an atmosphere after more than 20 years. And she used to keep the Slavic words necessary to give the flavor of this period, like words related to food, drinks, and Slava, and some other special holidays in this country. But and the book was translated into Romanian from Spanish. And the translation was also extraordinary. I was so amazed, so impressed by this novel that I recommend it, because it's a demonstration that translation doesn't mean only to translate from one language to another, but to be able also as a writer to translate foreign event into knowledgeable and understandable story for others.
Thank you very much, because that leads on very nicely to my next question, which is really about how does the translator, or as acting as a kind of proactive editor in a way, should they be just thinking about meaning when they're translating the book, or should they be thinking about flavor? Like you're mentioning there, is the flavor more important, the atmosphere, than the actual conciseness of the words? Will?
I think I'm pretty pragmatic and flexible, or rather wishy-washy about that. I don't have a particular line. I guess I'm a fairly mechanical translator, and the flavor and the style tends only to come out in the final phases, I guess, of my work. So I hope I've been more or less successful in giving, transporting the flavors of different books and different authors. But I think faithfulness for me is the most important. And then through my personal filter, that style hopefully comes out in the end, but I don't know.
What about Katarina? I know Jamie Bullock is your husband, and he has a lot of experience with the German translation.
Yeah, and I think his method is to translate very faithfully to start with, So his first draft will be a very, he'll be translating what is there on the page, and then he'll set the original aside and look at the English. Because I think every translator has to be a writer. You need to set the German aside or the language aside, and then just work on what makes an English text. I think you can quite often hear a language in a translation in a not terribly successful way. So German, for example, has lots of slightly superfluous words like noch and schon, which I think most of the time, they get used a lot in German, and most of the time, if you took them out of the English, it's not, still or already, you're not going to lose anything from it at all. I read a translation from German recently where I think in about 3/4 of a page there were 8 alreadys, and none of them really added to the text at all. So that's what he does, and then I think he would then go back to the German for anything that's still not quite making sense, and engage again with the original. But essentially, at some point you have to step away. Not away. It sounds unfaithful, but to step away from the original to see what's actually going to work as an English. You're making an English book in the end. Yeah.
Because
so there are, I think there are various stages, and some translators go through, I think, 9 drafts.
Yeah. So the translator is not only the first reader, the closest reader, but the first editor, right? In a way, right?
Yeah.
Before it goes on to another. Because I edit most of the books I publish, certainly with the books from Serbo-Croatian, I'm going to use that as a shorthand. Because I speak Serbo-Croatian, I can go back to the original. And also, not only that, because I don't always do that, but also I kind of understand sometimes the humor, or I understand what they're saying just because it's so familiar from that language. And I wonder somehow if this is a disadvantage in a way, because I'm actually maybe missing things that are not going to be familiar to the English reader, because I'm too familiar with the
too
source.
Close to it.
Yeah. And I was talking earlier about an incident we had in one of the early books we published, which was a kind of comic scene set in the Yugoslav parliament during the breakdown, where everyone was arguing, and you could see that the war was on its way, and of course a very serious scene, but it was rendered as a comic scene in the Croatian, and the Croatian was really funny. But then when we got to the English version, nothing to do with the bad translation, but it just wasn't funny. It just looked a bit upsetting and pathetic, because obviously it was a serious subject. So Will and I discussed it, and we talked with the author. We said, should we take it out? Because I don't know if it works but it's so funny. I said, yes, in the original, but not in the English. Anyway, against my better judgment, we left it in, and interestingly, the American publishers of the same book, I think Buzz Poole is here somewhere, they took it out, and I think that they made the right decision. So.
Well, that's a shame, because you don't want to lose anything.
Yeah, that's it.
You don't want to lose anything, but sometimes you just have to admit to yourself that it doesn't quite work.
Yeah, exactly.
Or find another joke.
Yeah, there were plenty of others, it's true. Just finally, before I open the floor to questions, I want to ask Magda a little bit about her experience with poetry. Because I always say that you can't pay someone to translate poetry, because, how do you pay someone by word to translate something which could take, 5 days to think of the right word, for example? It's very difficult to pay someone. I only published 1 book of poetry, and I did that myself, and it took years before I finally got to the final version. So what's your experience? You've translated French and English poetry into Romanian. How much do you edit when you're doing that then?
Well, my experience as a translator is not so large, but nevertheless, I've noticed that it is easier to translate from French poetry into Romanian, because both of them are Latin languages. But on the other side, when I translated English poets into Romanian, I discovered that it was more interesting and in a way more poetic. Why? Because the French language is a very regulated, normalized language. In which the rhymes are very similar, and the accent is always on the last syllable of the word. So this creates a very regular language, while Romanian is a language where the accent is everywhere. It is a tonic accent, and the rhymes are very diverse. So it is a little bit uncomfortable to translate from French into Romanian or vice versa because of this difference of accent, for example. While with English it's not the same because English has different accents like Romanian. So it's more, in a way, it's easier.
You feel liberated a little bit by the
Yes,
differences.
I feel liberated.
Yeah.
And moreover, I have the impression that the words in English have kept their aura or magic or music more than the French ones. It's
We think that too, don't we?
Maybe it's a subjective opinion, but sometimes I have this impression that French is a more rationalized language than English. English is more mysterious,
eccentric, perhaps.
Eccentric, yes. So it was an interesting experience for me to translate Paul Celan's poems from Romanian into English. You know that Paul Celan was a great poet of German language. He used to write in German, but at the beginning he was born in Romania at that time, and so he spoke also Romanian. His first poetic texts were in Romanian. They were not published abroad. And they were just a few, seven prose poems. So I decided to translate them into English, but with the help of a native English-speaking poet, because I think it's impossible otherwise. You have to have a specific feeling of the language which is native.
I think co-translations work very well with poetry.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
One from the source language and the other from the target language. Yeah.
Yes, and these 7 prose poems by Paul Celan took me and my friend, the American poet Christopher Merrill, 2 whole days to talk about, because it was interesting and difficult to translate and to transpose the nuances of the text, because they were surrealistic texts. And so crazy that it was difficult to grasp all the meanings of each word or each expression or metaphor into English. Finally, we did it, and these poems were published in the States with rather successful.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Are they published in a book or online?
In a book by Christopher Merrill. So I can give you a...
Lovely. I suppose we have a microphone, do we? How are people supposed to... There, we do. Yes, so do we have questions from the audience? I think I'm going to open it up now. So put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Don't leave us lonely up here. Wonderful, thank you. So we have 2 at the front here. Can we... can somebody volunteer to do that? Thank you. Thank you. Is this lady here?
My name's Joanna. I translate from Polish, French, German, Norwegian to English. And I wanted to go back to the thing that you said about the patronymics, Susie, when you were talking about Russian. Because I have the same problem with the huge number of diminutives in Polish names. So you can have one person and she can be Barbara and Basia, Basienka, Bacha. And I just wondered how you would... I mean, I can tell the way I tend to deal with it is to use some sort of descriptor. So if it's Basienka, it's Barbara, he said lovingly, or something like that. But how would you like to see that? If you were reading the book, as a reader, how do you like to see that translated to make it clear to you?
Did everyone get that? Did everyone hear that? Yes? Great. So, Will, do you want to... Because you're also a Russian speaker, Russian translator. What would you...
don't do many literary translations from Russian, but with Serbo-Croat we have the same issue sometimes, and I often use modifiers, either an adjective, small, cute, sweet, or said lovingly, like you suggested
really
yourself,
nice.
that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yes? Similar.
No, I think that sounds really nice the way you've done it, but yeah, we haven't had that come up very much.
It's from the Slavic languages that happens quite a lot with the diminutives. Right?
Yes, then how you let the reader know that you're talking about the same character, because sometimes those names can be almost totally different. So
yes, and it's
nice
very nice. They have a very nice
experienced.
shorthand for it, don't they? Yeah, we don't. Yeah, much more cumbersome. Yeah, yes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that.
I think that's
Thank
one
you.
of the few things that can afford to get lost in translation. It's just too much foreign nitty-gritty. I'm often fairly brutal with diminutives. Even if there are 2 or 3 different diminutives for a person, I'll generally use their normal first name and just modify it a bit.
Yeah. Thank you. I think there's a lady up the front here.
Hello, my name's Andrea. I translate from French and Spanish. I'm really interested in these ideas of glossary and local flavour. I'm going to try and make this quite short, but I've got lots of ideas going around about that. I'm translating a book at the moment, which is a work of historical fiction written by a French author. It's set in tribal Africa and Guadeloupe, and he uses a lot of terms in Zama language, which is a language from Niger, and in Creole. And he's used a glossary at the back. A lot of these words can't just be said to have something to do with local flavour. For me, they're necessary because they are things about societal organisation, or they're things about objects like musical instruments that you simply don't
They
exist.
don't have equivalents, yeah.
Or used in a different way. There's a particular drum in Guadeloupe that was used to send messages, a bit like Indian smoke message signals. That's it. So I suppose my question is, should a glossary just be word for word? Are you just doing it to help the reader understand, and you're just doing it to add local flavour to the book? Or are you thinking about further informing the reader and saying, well, I can't translate this word from king in Zama, because if you translate that for me, I think about King
Yeah, but
Charles I.
you could give equivalents. You can say this is something that's like what like this drum or like that. I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, I think glossaries it's a matter of choice for the reader, as long as it's signalled at the front, the back. I think so many people would be grateful for it that you can afford to go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so you wouldn't just do word for word. You might think about adding.
Yeah, and it can be quite a narrative, a couple of more rather than just a list. It can be even a sort of narrative, couple of pages. So, sounds interesting.
Does your publisher have some kind of ethnological mission?
I haven't found a publisher yet.
Yes. Question over here. Thank you for your question. Chris has got a great booming voice, so he'll be fine.
Hi, 2 questions. I'm a translator from Bulgarian, so we're kind of close. We joined together in Macedonia. 2 things, really. First thing, a big debate in Bulgaria. This is just a comment. One of the, inverted commas, great writers in Bulgaria, Milan Ruskov, has ignited an enormous debate in Bulgaria in saying that he needs no editing whatsoever. He won't accept any editor at all. The second thing, though, is more specific. It's a problem that I find translating a text which was kind of stream of consciousness, very evocative story from a remote country region in Bulgaria, and it's tenses. I don't know how it is in Macedonia, but in Bulgaria, a writer will constantly change tenses. And I actually began to think that this worked quite well in English, provided it was in sort of alternate paragraphs rather than not taking place in the same paragraph. And I actually wrote a translator's foreword to sort of explain why I'd chosen to do that, because I thought it worked well in the circumstances. But I wonder what you do about tenses.
Yeah. I mean, tenses, I'm sure Will back me up here, are often problematic when you're looking, I think, probably from the Slavic languages, certainly from Serbo-Croatian. They start in the past tense, drift into the present, back to the past, and you just think, hang on a minute, no one's going to understand when this thing happened, right? Because we're very specific in English. I think usually we put them back in, don't we, quite forcefully, Will?
Except if there's a scene that's really lively and vivid, and you can render it in the sort of the present continuous. What do you call it? present, but that's rare. I think
Or if
generally
it's a joke, because of course we do that in English, don't we? When it's a joke, we like start the joke and then we say it, even though it's about the past, we say it in the present tense. And I think that's why they use it, because it makes it feel very immediate, right? But it's very confusing for the English reader. But I mean, if you put brave of you to put her forward. I mean, why not try it, I suppose? Yeah. As for the editing part, I have worked with some books that were obviously not edited in the original. I'd asked the author, and they were very resistant. They considered the fact that, well, the book is published, you don't need to touch it now, even though it actually hadn't been for any rigorous editing in the original, yeah. So it does happen. I think you just have to battle it out with the author. I think Ruskov might find it problematic coming into English. Yeah.
Well, sometimes they're right. Sometimes their books are completely perfect.
Ah, there we go. Looking on the bright side.
We haven't even talked about punctuation. Oh my God.
That's true. That's a whole other story. Any other questions? Yes, lady here.
Hello, my name is Dasha, and I'm a master student of translation here in London School of Oriental and African Studies. So thank you all of you for your time, and hearing your hands-on experience has been very inspirational for me. As a translation student, I'm doing a master thesis this year, and I'm actually going to be talking a lot about dialect translation. So I would like to revisit what you mentioned, Mr. Firth. But actually, question for all of you about what was your experience, and especially when you mentioned that the Scottish accent or the dialect would not work, why you thought it wouldn't for you personally, or in your experience, what would work in translation dialects? Thank you.
That book that I mentioned and that experience is actually my only one where I've actually gone the whole hog and done that. And due to the mixed reaction, I've decided not to do that anymore. And there have been 2 or 3 books since then when I could have done that, but I've adopted to go a more cautious path and just render it as fairly casual English, maybe with a few slangish markers, with a few references to this being rural speech or something like that, in a more sort of gentle but cautious way. I'm not convinced that it works terribly well, but that's me. I mean, there may be much bolder translators out there who will adopt some English idiom somewhere. I started school in Scotland, and so I have 3 years of Scottish English in me, so that sort of was the reason why I chose Scottish. I thought it would work, and it sort of semi-worked, but it was an experiment, like I say. I think every translator has to find his or her own way with challenges like that.
We published the Norwegian novels of Roy Jacobsen, and the first of a trilogy was called The Unseen, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker last year, and it's just been on the shortlist now of the Dublin Literary Awards. So it's actually done very well. But at the process of translating, it's translated by Don Bartlett and Don Shaw. And Don Bartlett very much wanted to convey, it's set on an island off the coast of Norway. Don Bartlett very much wanted to convey the remoteness of it, and he chose a sort of Northumberland dialect. And we had quite a lot of conversation about whether we should retain that or not, because I found it slightly off-putting, and then I got used to it when I read more of the book. But just reading a couple of pages, I thought, this is really... and we decided to retain it, and it got fantastic reviews, and some reviewers questioned it, but nobody said this was a really shocking idea. On the other hand, we haven't found an American publisher for him yet, partly because I think they find it just a little bit too remote. They're just finding it a bit too... I mean, they could do a similar thing with an American dialect, but then it's getting an awful long way away from an island off the coast of Norway. So there's no solution, really. It is quite a bold move in the end, but we stuck with it, and we're going to continue with that for the rest of the trilogy. But the question of which dialect you choose that might be equivalent is a really difficult one, and I suppose that's down to what the translator is more familiar with in terms of being able to kind of convey difference. So it hasn't come up very much, though. That's one of the few occasions that it really has. And yeah, lots of discussion.
Interesting. Any other questions? No.
There's one there.
Where? What did you see?
I just wanted
Annie.
to ask the panel whether they have been in a situation where an author who you're translating, who speaks English, comes back to you after you send them the translation you've made and starts arguing about tinsy little words because they think they know more English than you and they think you've made mistakes.
Everyone's kind of smiling knowingly. Magda, have you ever had that experience?
Well, not exactly, but translating poetry is a little bit more like this. I mean, each poet has his or her own dialect, and the one has to adapt to this poetic jargon, so to say, and to find an equivalent. And authors will always be unsatisfied with what you find, what you translate, because it's normal. They feel like their poem is unique and it has an aura, a magic that has to be transmitted. But they don't know exactly the target language, and they just approximate about it. And sometimes they do not understand exactly what it sounds like in the target language. So
exactly, yeah. Will, have you had argumentative authors, dissatisfied authors?
Very occasionally. No, generally it's gone well.
Yeah. I think that's going to be it for now. My last question was going to be about censorship in editing, and I see that Nikki Harman is here, and I was going to draw on her Chinese experience, but we'll have to leave it till next year. Next year. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the panel, and come to speak to us if you want to.